Welcome, everyone. And yeah, this is a little bit, it's not as if it's the first time that we do programs up here, but it's a little bit sort of undergone some renovation. So everything is slightly new, including some of the aspects of the technology here. But I'm very happy to see you all. And the scope of this program really is Buddhist theory and practice. So the first hour, basically from 5 until 6, I'm going to be discussing a little bit Buddhist theory, particularly something called Abhidharma, which you could say is the Buddhist science of mind. And then around 6, we'll have a very short break. And then I'll say a little bit about Buddhist meditation. And then from 6:30 until 7, I think next week we might start to do it a little bit longer, but I think just the first, because we're not organized yet. Next week we'll probably do it a little bit longer. Anyway, that's the program. So I'd like to, just to those of you who are following online, I'm having a little bit of an issue with the camera being blurry. So anyway, I'm pretty much the only thing you have on camera, so you're not really missing out. So I think you can just you can see the Buddha, you can see Tara, you can see Sentient Rinpoche, even though it is a bit blurry. So I apologize about that. Okay. Yeah. So Buddhist theory. The whole thing about meditation and so forth, the way that it's normally sort of spoken about in the general discourse of our culture, is that it's something that's going to make you feel good. And that's right. Meditation makes you feel good. There's not really a whole lot of rocket science in it. You're going to be told to sit quiet and watch your breath. It can't get too complicated, and it's really not stressful. Actually, I do this this is my job. And people say, wow, you're doing so many programs. Isn't it exhausting? And I sort of go, well, how could it ever be exhausting to tell people to sit down and not do anything? It's like the nature of the whole thing is actually pretty friendly and peaceful as such. But there is actually a whole dimension that we run into when it comes to Buddhism. And it's something that very often leads people to believe that Buddhism is a religion, but that's not exactly true. But you run into a phenomenology, you run into a science of experience. And that's where the Buddhism gets a bit weird from our cultural perspective, because we're sort of brought up in a very reliable science. We call it empirical science and sort of verifiable science, which generally operates with things that we can observe, verify for ourselves, that can be reproduced and so forth. And anything that sort of lies outside of what we define as science, which is objective, material, tangible, measurable, quantifiable, such as the mind, is a little bit sort of a gray zone. And of course, we do have psychology that you could say is a mapping of the mind. But in Buddhism, the science of the mind goes quite a bit further, because it goes into a place of extraordinary qualities of the mind. And that is where we talk about these strange things that we call enlightenment. That's why in Buddhism you have a lot of emphasis on the people who actually have some so we've reserved a seat for you over here. In Buddhism, there's a lot of, you could say, respect for those who embody this, and that's why it's a little bit different. You know, probably if you're seeing a psychoanalyst, you're probably not going to have pictures of him on your shrine, or people who are well, possibly some people who are analysts, they might have a little bust of Sigmund Freud or something like that, or Jung or what have you. But apart from that, the individual experience, the so-called first-person subjective realization or experience, doesn't really qualify as science within our modern understanding. However, in Buddhism, the whole thrust of Buddhist understanding of the mind is very much based on what we could call empirical, because it is about what we can assert ourselves. It's not something we can necessarily measure or quantify, and it's not necessarily something that you could say you could have a whole group of 300 people that all sort of show. Within mindfulness, you do have peer-reviewed papers that sort of assert the value of mindfulness and so forth. But in Buddhism, the individual first-person experience is understood as being empirical. It is what we, each and every one of us, can verify. So we do not regard this as just belief systems or you could say nice old legends and so forth. There's very much a sense of speaking to us in terms of a verifiable, immediate experience. And there's a lot to be said about this experiencer. In fact, within academia and the sort of some of the challenges that modern day science goes through is really the assumption that science really is a sort of a forever on an increasing trajectory of more and more knowledge, which interestingly has been challenged from within the academy itself. It's very, very particular from different ages what we assert as science. There's a French social analyst called Michel Foucault who's made a big, you could say, research into this, and also Thomas Kuhn, an American scientist, also made this point that that science really operates within these paradigms, and sometimes we have these what we can call breakdowns, scientific breakdowns or scientific revolutions, where all of a sudden things just don't work. And then we need to shift into a different, you could say, way of understanding our reality. And actually, as far as something called consciousness goes, we actually are at this kind of place in modern science, because within neuroscience itself, by its own admission, consciousness is not something that's actually understood. We can understand a lot of things in the world, but consciousness is what's known as the hard problem of science. And one of the great neuroscientists in the US, John Searle, he would say, if ever there was to be a scientific finding that would be revolutionary and define the sort of the great finding of this age, it would be how we can understand that consciousness originates. He actually goes on to say how consciousness could originate out of neurobiological systems. But that in itself is also, you could say, an assumption that consciousness is something that originates from the brain or from neurons and so on. Anyway, it's just to say that when we approach Buddhism, we are walking into an area that is scientific, but it comes with Buddhism, and doesn't matter which Buddhism you're talking about, whether it's Zen or the Theravadan tradition or the Chinese Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism. All of these, they operate without what we could call religious assumptions. Of course, when we travel to Tibet or Nepal, we're going to see lots of things, and even your tour guide will tell you, well, you know, the religion here has developed along these, you know, along these patterns and so on. But it is not actually religion. It's not what we would say based on some belief system or some cultural baggage, any more than you could say if somebody came from the outside, they would say all dentists and scientists, what is dentistry? Well, it's that you wear a white coat, or that if you're a scientist, you wear a white coat. Well, that's only a minor part of it. We don't really define science in terms of what people are wearing. And so if you travel in Buddhist countries, you might look at the external signs of these cultures and think, well, that's cultural. Indeed, but what's behind it is certainly not cultural. So that's an important point, and I make this sort of, I come back to this again and again. This is a pet peeve of mine, because I think it's rather sad that a great science of mind as Buddhism is being lost nowadays, effectively through this assumption and this misunderstanding. So with that, then, what we're studying and what is known as Abhidharma is really looking into what the mind is. Now, what of course is the whole objective of the Buddhist path is not so much that we're going to get the equation right, or we're going to get some, you know, we're going to develop an elegant philosophy, but it's really, the Buddha really came from a place of wishing to cure universally a condition of suffering. And that's what in Buddhism is referred to as samsara. It's a basic delusional condition, a basic cognitive dysfunction that takes place within each and every one of us, which essentially boils down to this insecurity that we call me, self. And that's where you come across this thing that also sounds incredibly weird in Buddhism, is that you talk about no self. I mean, Buddhists, they talk about rebirth, they talk about enlightenment. Well, who is it that attains enlightenment? Who is it that's reborn? Who is it, in fact, that I am if there's no self? You know, here I am. I call myself Jakob. I have a passport. I have a driver's license, and so on. What's that? What's no self gonna? How that's ever gonna work in that? And effectively, what we are talking about with no self is essentially just when the mind is not caught up in this problem of essentially what we could call self-consciousness, when there is this sense of me as the center of the universe. Because we could actually see that we as humans, we're far better when we're much more out of our heads and we're much more sort of attentive to the other. When we're in a situation where we have to give, despite sort of initial trepidations about having to give, maybe do public talking, heaven forbid, or having to do a job interview, or maybe meet the new, you know, in-laws or whatever it might be, we sort of retract and would like to sort of hide away, or we might have to organize something and do something, or maybe we're sort of responsible for things. But when we go out of ourselves and our comfort zone and give, we actually rise and we actually open up and flourish as individuals. And that's where, interestingly, within our experience, there is a general recognition and you could say experience of what no self means, because it's when we don't retract into this comfort zone of me. And that's very often where you could say the spirituality gets hijacked, because very often we approach spirituality thinking, oh, that's where I can sort of escape into some sort of cosmic comfort zone where maybe everything's all right, and then I can come back to the evil world. But actually, that unfortunately you won't find in the Buddhist teaching. There's not really any escape in the Buddhist teaching. There's rather a looking hard at our reality and at the assumptions about our reality, and particularly working with this condition of our own mind where we do retract into this fixating on a self. And that's, interestingly enough, where meditation works. And the whole general science around the mind in Buddhism is actually looking into our assumptions about self, our person, and basically asking the question, is there really any solid self? And that's where we come across the fact that what we call self is in fact a construction. It's in fact something that's made up of many different things. There's the component of our body, which is entirely a private experience. There's the component of our mind, which is many a colored beast, which is so many different things and changing basically every moment. So to talk about a continuous self is very problematic. And actually, of course, we say there's a cognition, but there's a place where we retract into some rather unconscious subscription to habitual ways of regurgitating narratives within ourselves that constitute and basically perpetuate this sense of I. And that's where very often when we have to step out of our comfort zone, we break this narrative and we feel all the better for it. And interestingly, despite what Buddhist meditation looks like, it's actually a place where we actually have a method for discontinuing the ordinary narratives that consolidate this sense of I. So while people might look like they're sort of going into their own sort of comfort zone where they're meditating, actually it's not like that. Buddhist meditation is actually where, through the practice of mindfulness, you actually step out of the ordinary narratives that perpetuate the sense of self. And so oddly enough, the Buddhist sage would emerge as somebody that actually is able to relinquish a fixation on a self. But before we get into the practice of meditation, we actually first make a case of establishing theoretically, you could say through our analysis, through a skeptical approach that analyzes, is there really basis for this assumption around a me? And is there also really a basis for an assumption around what we call solid phenomena? Because the external phenomenal world that we perceive, we label it as objects that we like and dislike, but from the objects themselves, they don't actually have particular identity as such. This cup doesn't think of itself as being cup. And me liking the design on it, the cup doesn't actually give a hoot of whether I like its design or not. There's nothing in the object that actually presents itself as possessing an essential, solid, enduring self. And that's where we can essentially, when we analyze the phenomenal world, and we are not in any way in disagreement with the natural sciences there, we can say, well, everything in the phenomenal world is in fact just causes and conditions that are continually in flux. And while this might lead us to saying, well, things are then impermanent, we can't expect them to last, and so forth, it actually means that there is no inherent existence in phenomena as such. For all practical purposes, there's James, there's Karma, there's Chris, there's Rod, yes, but these are, and you can ask Karma about James, and you can ask Chris about Rod, and they will confirm that these entities are changing, and they changed unpredictably. But then again, they don't change entirely randomly, but they change according to certain causes and conditions. If you don't feed the beast, then the beast is going to be grumpy. Or if you're not on time or whatever, all sorts of things sort of play in. But phenomena are continually shifting, and that's why we can't say there's an actual solid self the way we label it. So that's where, again, we unfortunately have a bad habit of objectifying phenomena as being solid in a way that they actually don't possess. So that's where we have to make a distinction between the way that things appear to us, which is very relative to how we see things. Like some people might, they might not like cups like this, and other people have a strong liking for cups like this and what have you, or the content or people or movies or music or what have you. We all have our own particular relative labeling of things, which we can understand is true for us, but is not an absolute. The same thing of saying, somebody is somebody's daughter, but it's another person's mother, and it's another person's spouse or partner or whatever. So these labels that we have, they're true, but they're only true relatively. And that's where we very often get stuck. This is where we begin to sort of, you can say in terms of present day politics, this is where we begin to have these camps that unfortunately become incredibly rigid once we fail to see that other people are seeing things differently. And that's where we begin to have these polarized positions and rigid camps and conflicts. While the more we can actually begin to understand how the other sees things, the more we have peace. When Buddhism promotes nonviolence and all of that, it's not that they're just nice people, but it's just that actually there's no basis for aggression unless you're sort of stuck with your own stubborn optics about how to see other things. If somebody says, I really love, Schubert, and somebody else doesn't, and somebody loves Stockhausen and somebody else hates Stockhausen, generally we're sort of aware that people have different tastes. And this amounts to what we could essentially call an understanding of the phenomenal world as being essentially dependent or conditioned on where we are and how we see things. And that insight, that is where we begin to rise out of our own personal vantage point and begin to see things from an aerial perspective. We take other people's view into consideration, and that is what we mean with Vipassana. Of course, there's a lot of ways to understand Vipassana, and sometimes Vipassana is understood as a technique. But basically speaking, within Buddhism, as much as you could say all Buddhism is about Vipassana, as such, then sometimes we refer to meditation technique as Vipassana. Vipassana is essentially means broader perspective, wider perspective, and it's essentially this wider seeing. And that's where we begin to move out of this self-centered way of seeing the world and into this dimension of no self. So that's where we're coming from when we talk about no self in Buddhism. All of this really just to sort of hone in on the topic of Abhidharma, and this is kind of the first or maybe the second class in this semester. So I'm sort of a little bit backtracking to sort of just get the bigger picture. But the point of that, of the, you could say, the Vipassana and the wisdom that we have in Buddhism is essentially to extract ourselves from an ordinarily stubborn, delusional position of fixating on ourselves and also on fixating on the way that we see things. And that's why the beauty of the sage is somebody who actually begins to have a wider perspective. That's why the Dalai Lama is incredibly endearing and lovely and friendly, and there's nobody who generally doesn't like the Dalai Lama, because he generally just seems to meet people where they are, and he seems to be very comfortable in doing that. And that is sort of generally the hallmark of a sage. So down through the ages, then, this way of, you can say, curing the mind from its ordinarily delusional rigidity has been seen as something that really resulted in something extremely beneficial in terms of curing, you could say, the illness of the mind. And in the Buddhist teaching, we talk about the Four Noble Truths, which is understanding that there is a basic discomfort, there's a basic pebble in the shoe, there's a basic universal condition where we struggle with our reality. And this struggle and this suffering that we have is not something that happens just in a random universe which has no purpose or no direction. And it also doesn't come imposed upon us as some sort of bizarre test that's being sort of handed to us from some outer creative agent, but it's simply just something that has to do with what's happening within our mind. And we can ourselves verify that there are times when our mind creates causes of suffering, and there are times when we are less caught up in this narrowness of mind. And simply what the Buddha taught then with the fourth noble truth, which is the truth of the path, is really how could we effectively work with this mind. And that's where we then have the Buddhist path, the Noble Eightfold Path, and so on, that all really is designed on providing the ideal conditions for clarifying the mind. So presently then, within Abhidharma, we're looking at analyzing the components of the mind. But last time I brought in a little bit of writing from somebody in the Tibetan tradition who I personally like a lot, and who is a very venerable sage. His name is Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche. And I just wanted to sort of bring in his comment a little bit, where he speaks about when we're approaching the notion of clarifying the mind, and when we're beginning to develop the sense of wisdom, we very often come across Buddhist teachings that will say, well, phenomena, they don't have any inherent existence. Like we have the Prajnaparamita teachings that will say, well, all phenomena are empty. You have the Heart Sutra that says whatever phenomena you have, they actually don't truly exist. And then you might sort of be a little bit confounded and say, my God, these Buddhists, they're saying that there's nothing that actually exists. You know, there's no form, no feeling, no perception, no eye, no ear, no nose, etc., etc., etc. You go through all of that, and then you go, whoa, what's left? You know. But actually, the only point, and that actually is in the Heart Sutra, where Avalokiteshvara, he says, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Form is no other than emptiness, emptiness is no other than form. And in there, Avalokiteshvara is talking about what we perceive of as solid. And these perceptions of our psychology are solid, the phenomenal world is solid. Yes, there's nothing that can be grasped about it, but yet they appear. Emptiness is no other than form. So what we're talking about is no other than what we actually perceive as the phenomenal world. But the thing is, we can't grasp it. And that's the only point. You could say the only point between us and the Dalai Lama is that we tend to get fixated on things. We tend to get a little bit sort of wound up, and the Dalai Lama doesn't. And of course, we could just say, well, the Dalai Lama says, don't get wound up, Occasionally you get these kind of emails, where it says, the Dalai Lama says, dance as if nobody's looking. It's, all these kind of things. So these kind of very beautiful things, they're sort of made for fridge magnets, sort of lovely little things, but signed the Dalai Lama, I'm not sure they actually do come from the Dalai Lama, but anyway, you could have a fridge magnet that says, don't get caught up, or just remain in the present, or be here now, Dalai Lama. Yeah, but it's a bit more than that. It's a bit more. It's more than just having the fridge magnet. It's a bit more than just running a mantra in your head. There actually is a bit of work done. And that's also where, unfortunately, you could say spirituality in the Western world very often is picked up as something that, oh yeah, that sounds great, and cool. And we kind of have a little bit of it's almost like I would say almost like a sort of well, there's various things that play in, but it's a little bit colonialist, this sort of thing that, oh yeah, we got these things, I went to India, and in India, the ethos is to just be relaxed, or, the Nepalis are terribly relaxed, the Tibetans are very relaxed and friendly, and let's just be relaxed and friendly. It's not quite enough. Unfortunately, we do have a science that really requires a lot of rigor, and there is actually something that needs to be done. And it's not as if just relaxing, which is of course a wonderful thing to do, is just going to do it. I mean, if we could relax all the time, that's great. And we're all for Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now, and for sure. But sometimes it's just not that easy. And that's where we have to, then the Buddha very kindly took into account that there's a requirement for having a little bit of an idea of what we're going into, and it's rather a big scope. And also there's a methodology about how to do this. Of course, actually I was talking with a friend of mine, and we were talking about how in Buddhism, it's very much like this is the way how to do it, and so much of our discovery is actually the tension that arises when we sort of, we tinker. We tinker with the mind, and we sort of bump our heads against the wall, and we learn from that. And it's a bit like if we're tinkering with car engines, and that makes for a lot of learning. We learn from so much from tinkering with our car engine. We should really approach mind from that point of view. But at the same time, you got to give it to them. If you talk to mechanics, or you talk to people who really know the car engine, they probably will say, yes, you can tinker, but this is how it actually is. This is how the car engine actually runs. And so in Buddhism, there is a science of how the mind works, which can be very helpful. Of course, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't tinker and experiment and so forth. But that's where there is a fair amount of, you could say, inquiry that goes into the project of enlightenment. And so when we have these teachings, for example, that talk about the nature of reality, we might sometimes think like, that's really weird and mystical. But if we begin to actually research it, there is actually, there's a lot of sense in what's being said. I want to hook up to where I left off last time. Yeah, there's a place here too, where it says, perceptions are experienced by mind. They're not experienced by water or earth, in the sense that whatever we experience is not experienced by a subjective knower. All the elements are vividly distinguished as long as the mind fixates on them. So whatever we perceive essentially exists on the basis of us knowing them. Yet they are nothing but a mere presence, an appearance. It is the mind that apprehends this mere presence. When this mind doesn't apprehend, hold, or fixate on what is experienced, in other words, when the real authentic samadhi of suchness dawns within your stream of mind, reality loses its solid obstructing quality. And that is, once the mind begins to settle into a place of actually not perpetuating the narratives and the habits and what we call essentially the obscurations of the mind that normally consolidate a solid fixation of on ourselves and also what we perceive, then the sort of rigidity of our experience begins to dissolve. So I'm just going to go down here then. So it says, for instance, the fact that one yogi's delusion dissolves doesn't mean everyone else's delusion vanishes as well. When someone gets enlightened, that person is enlightened, not everyone else. When a yogi transcends fixation, only the deluded experience of that one person dissolves. Please think about this. There is, however, another aspect called others' experience or general experience of sentient beings. And this, of course, is where the science of Buddhism doesn't say, this is how reality is. Like everything is, you say, the unity of appearance and emptiness. That is something that we need to realize. And that's why you can say the individual, for example, the reason why in the Buddhist teaching you actually honor sages is because there is actually someone who understood reality. But just because they come back and say, reality is like this, it's not as if we're just going to say, okay, hey, that's cool, that we needed to realize this for ourselves. It's a bit like if we have to do public speaking, you're going to have to talk at your best friend's wedding, right? And then somebody who's a experienced public speaker says, well, all you got to do is just relax and just speak straight from your heart. And you look at this person and go, yeah, thanks a lot, mate. I'll just do that. But then again, you might end up having to do this for a long time. And actually, yes, that happens. The truths that we are proposing in the Buddhist teaching are not something that we can just pick up intellectually, but they're actually something that needs to be applied within our own experience. And that is why there actually is something as annoying in Buddhism as what's called the path. It's not enough that we just have some great coffee table books about beautiful Tibet and Bhutan, or we have all the right spiritual books, up on the bookshelf and all of that. That's just not going to really cut it. So there has to be this annoying thing that actually we have to experience and practice this. I mean, it's up to us if we want to. Nobody's forcing us. But this proposition, this sort of provocation that lies in that enlightenment could take place, that necessarily is something that we have to do ourselves. And that's also why at the end of the Buddha's life, then we have this famous line where he says, I've shown you liberation, but ultimately the experience of liberation depends on your own effort. So that's why we would say it is entirely up to us to actually experience this. So then to says, this song is seemingly solid reality. And then it says, Rinpoche knocks on wood of his bed. There's not a thing that is indestructible. Whatever is material in this world will be destroyed in fire at the end of the cloud. There's no exception. Except this fire then is okay. This is roughly because Buddhist we call it and other places. You have a model of the universe, the cosmos, which is different from us. It's not as if you have, the solar system and so on. It's a little bit different. So that's why sometimes we come across, you could say, references that definitely are cultural, but that we shouldn't really mistake for what is really the point that we're trying to make here. So you don't go to the Buddhists, and if you want to know about the solar systems, I'm sorry to say, with all due respect. And the Dalai Lama himself has famously said, look, as far as myself, he says, I've never had a problem with science. He says, it never ever has challenged my Buddhist faith. He says, there's only one victim of in studying science, and that is that I no longer believe in the traditional cosmology that we had in Tibet. He says, I no longer believe in Mount Meru, which means, the sort of the mountain in the middle of the universe. So that's, of course, that sort of cosmology, that's secondary. But as far as understanding that phenomena don't exist solidly, that is something that is universal. So that's where we could say the science of Buddhism really applies. So then Tugurje says, try to spend some time on Nangjang training. And those people who've studied Dzogchen, they might say, oh, but that's a very advanced Dzogchen practice and so on. Well, yeah, it is. But at the same time, Nangjang, which means purifying perception, really runs as a red thread throughout all of the various Buddhist teachings, and particularly Abhidharma, because it's where we go in and we begin to analyze our perceptions and whether they actually exist the way that we normally think they do. And Tugurje says, try and spend some time on this kind of Nangjang perception training of refining your perceptions, he says, and you will discover that all of reality is insubstantial and unreal. By means of Nangjang training, we discover that all experience is personal experience, and that all personal experience is seen as unreal and insubstantial when not fixated upon. And that's again where in the Abhidharma teaching, we would say we have a particular experience based on our way of perceiving. For example, we would perceive a particular object, a particular person or a particular object, and we would say, I like or I don't like. And this is really where you could say war begins, because that's where we begin to have, we label the other in a particular way as alien, different from us. We other them in the sense of creating them as something that exists objectively out there as different. But if we begin to analyze, in fact, what we're just experiencing is a perception that we're labeling in a particular way. And that perception is based on our sound, it's based on sight, it's based on thoughts. And then those thoughts that we have, they're again based on particular conditioning. So, I come from Denmark, right? And then people outside of Denmark, they think, my God, all Danes are ludicrous, or stupid, or whatever they might say. Or all Danes are terribly friendly. But anyway, whatever it might be, you just need to meet a dozen Danes and you'll find out, well, in fact, it's complex. You can't just say that one way or another. And one of the most important discoveries we do when we study Abhidharma, and in general, when we come across life, is that we begin to become aware of complexity, that we can't just make simple, one-sided, simplistic statements about things. And that is then what the study facilitates. So Tugurje says, in this entire world, there is no created appearance that ultimately remains. Seemingly external visual forms do not really remain anywhere. These mere perceptions are dependent karmic experiences. So there's a little bit of Buddhist vocab in there. What Tugurje is saying that when we say mere perceptions are dependent karmic experience means the way that we see things are unique to us. And the way that our optics are created is basic to the way that we have been habituated to seeing things. So we might have been brought up in a particular way. We might, in the course of our life, have developed particular opinions. And on the basis of that, we tend to see things and perceive things in particular ways. So that is what we could say karmic experience. This is shaped by our particular sense of our individuality, and on the basis of our individuality, our likes and dislikes. And this then, when we act on it in terms of how we speak and how we act physically and also how we engage mentally, it lays down patterns in our consciousness. And this is what we call karma. Karma is really not anything mystical. It's just the patterns that we lay down within our consciousness, and that we then, you could say, repeatedly come back to. So this is what Goodman says: these mere perceptions are dependent karmic experience. All of relative reality is by definition dependent on something other, upon causes and conditions. He says, isn't it? And we have to admit that whatever we experience is necessarily based on how we see things. So, of course, we can say, well, that goes without saying, but in our everyday life, we very often hold on to our particular viewpoint as being true and remain rather rigid about it. So Goodman says, when explaining relative phenomena, you have to mention their causes and conditions. There's no way around it. And this is then again what we do with Abhidharma. In the end, we realize that their nature is ultimately beyond causes and conditions. What is ultimate cannot be made out of causes and conditions. And what is meant there, that is that once we understand that phenomena, the way that we see things, actually don't exist the way that we label them, that's already beginning to be a bit wise. So if somebody says, I really love the music of Metallica, or I really love the music of Beethoven, or whatever it might be, and we don't particularly like that kind of music, the moment that we say, my opinion is already just my opinion, we understand the relativity of our experience, that's already wisdom. I'm sorry to say, but if we insist that Beethoven is really the only one, then we're obviously, I mean, we might just be wanting the argument for the argument's sake, but it's obvious that we make mistakes. And likewise, also when people talk about food and when they talk about politics, yes, people will be conditioned by their particular circumstances. And that's where we are beginning to approach what we could call ultimate truth, the moment that we just realize that there actually is no truth. Now, this is something that has been a little bit a cause of, you could say, trouble in philosophy in the West, because when we begin to understand that there is no ultimate truth, and this, of course, we have in Western philosophy in 20th century, we actually understand that truth is something so relative that perhaps there is no truth, then there's been a little bit of a tendency in the humanities and in general within our culture to say, well, there is no truth. We're lost. And that essentially falling into this sort of nihilistic view where you say, well, the truths that used to exist, they're no longer there. We don't believe in the motherland. We don't believe in God. We don't believe in the family. We don't believe in institutions. We don't believe in tradition. We don't believe in truth. And that's sort of a very sort of postmodern attitude to have, which is really that, you know, there's nothing that's really true. But that's actually a whole new truism that belies the fact that we operate with truth all the time. It makes a huge difference when you're nice to somebody or if you're nasty to somebody. Truth exists all the time. It makes handshake, you might say, is a handshake the ultimate sort of way of greeting? Yeah, but it's a relative thing. But you know, in our culture we do that, and it's an expression of just friendliness. So now we hug and all of that. And well, as of late we don't. But anyway, the whole thing is that truth is there, but we just have to understand that it's relative. But to understand that truths are relative, it enables us to have a much broader perspective. And that's where we can begin to approach, you could say, a truth that really is, you could say, enduring or ultimate, if we're willing to say that truth is something that's very relative. And that's where we begin to have a truth of wisdom, that we actually begin to understand reality. So that's why we, in the Buddhist teaching, we definitely talk about ultimate truth. But the paradox is that that truth that we're talking about is actually that we realize how true it is that these relative constructions that we label truth actually are only relative. And that's where if you go and if you go and play a piece of Metallica or Stockhausen for the Dalai Lama and say, this is fantastic music, Your Holiness, the Dalai Lama will say, yeah, that's great music. And then you play something completely different And he'll also say, yes, yes, that's great music, because he can see that you're loving it, you know. So he'll just, yeah, it's true. So in that sense, there's a famous quote from a sutra called "The Meeting of Father and Son," which is actually when the Buddha went back to visit his father. His mother had passed away, but his father was still alive. And in there, the Buddha says, whatever people of the world, they say, I agree with them. And yet, I don't agree with the world at all. Because yes, whatever the people will say of the world, in the world, that's true for them. So we can agree with everybody, and yet understanding that there is no ultimate truth that holds, in the sense of that there's some absolute, then to know that makes us all the wiser. And that we could call truth. So there is a, you could say, the vipassana that you could say extends beyond the normal notion of self, is what basically enables us to take away a filter, the filter of censorship that we normally operate with through our likes and dislikes, and through our sort of partisanship or our bias or our prejudice, where we say this is good, this is bad. And we can say, yeah, for sure, it's good, it's bad, from the particular point of view. So that's where Vipassana is, when we begin to understand this wider perspective. And that it never ever means that there's nothing whatsoever, because it still means that, well, we still need 3 meals a day. For some people, this one thing is necessary. For another person, something else is necessary. Within the world that we function, there is very much what we could call a functioning relative truth. But beginning to look into this and beginning to see the relativity of phenomena is then this approach of purifying our perceptions, of looking at the constructed nature of our perceptions. That is then the scope of the Abhidharma teaching. So at this point, actually, then we will get around to looking at the Abhidharma text. I think we'll probably be finishing for today, but at least you can rest reassured that next time I will actually start getting into the text. So let's just see. I'm going to read just a few things from. See, this text here, it was written by Steven Goodman, who just passed away recently, but he was a lovely person, and he was a student of Buddhism for probably half a century, most of his life. Studied with a number of great Buddhist teachers from various traditions, and he then was professor at something called California Institute for Integral Studies for the last couple of decades of his life, and there he taught Abhidharma, and he ended up writing this book, which is then called The Buddhist Psychology of Awakening, and that's the one then that we're looking at. So in there, we're presently then approaching this way that we actually begin to, you could say, dismantle our perceptions. And that's where we talk about some famous Buddhist topics that come from the Abhidharma, that have to do with what we call skandhas, the 5 skandhas, the way that we construct our sense of self, and also ayatanas, the way that we interact with our perceptions. So the way that we actually operate in terms of objects, perception of objects, how that functions on the combination of essentially 3 aspects, which is the object, the organ faculty, and the consciousness that then experiences this. And on the basis of this, you say these conditions that come together, that we have individual moments of experience. So everything that we experience, in fact, is made up of, you could say, a lot of different components. And that's where the more that we're aware of these components, the less we're held by them. So that's where we presently are going to be looking at something called sixfold processing, which is essentially operating with the 5 senses and also our thought process. So in Buddhism, we talk about, we can call them the six senses, but it's nothing supernatural. It's really just that we include thought and thinking as a sense. It's because on the basis of our perceptions, then also we have thought. I'll look at that wall and I'll think white, and that's a perception I'm having that's being registered by my consciousness. So that's, you could say, the sixth consciousness, or the sixth sense. So we'll continue with that next time then, and we'll take it from there. The place in the book called Exercise in Sixfold Processing. So like I said, I hope you'll bear with me for a little bit, wanting to sort of encapture, or rather you could say, put all of this into context before we immerse ourselves into the study of Abhidharma. Okay, let's just see if there's some questions from the online audience. Haha. A small request for next time. Would it please be possible to do a small recap on the book up to this point we left? Okay, I'll do that next time. I'll try to see how small I can do that recap. But yeah, okay, I'll just go over the basics of it. And I think really just keep in mind that all Steven is saying is really to be aware that whatever we perceive is, you can say, comes from the constructed nature of our perceptions. Also in the humanities, we talk about something called constructionism, or social constructivism, and so on, which is understanding that we're different persons depending on the context. We all go home to our parents, and they'll mother us and smother us, and sort of relate to us in a way that we sort of are horrified that we sort of go into being child again, and when we're with either our parents, or maybe we go to a reunion with our old classmates, and all of a sudden we're sort of reenacting the whole sort of ridiculous sort of culture of our old class, right? So we're different people depending on who we're with. If we're with our boss, or if we're with our lover, or our children, or whatever it might be. So we're different people depending. So the whole constructed nature is really what you could say the whole book so far is about. Okay, somebody says, excellent presentation of the view and what we're doing here, Jakob. Thank you very much. Okay.
So someone like the Dalai Lama, that fact that, like you're saying, we're different people and all the rest of it, a sort of a sign of someone who's quite accomplished is that they seem even in all sorts of different situations. They're not buffeted by other people's projections and get swept. They've got this sort of gravitas.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what?
Yeah, but it's a bit more than that, because yes, the Dalai Lama, we could say, definitely expresses gravitas and evenness, but it comes from a place of seeing clearly. And that's where you could say the Dalai Lama's wisdom lies in seeing properly. The Dalai Lama's wisdom is more than just, you could say, the nice friendly demeanor and his sort of easygoing style. It's just that he sees clearly. And he sees that, for example, when he talks about my Chinese brothers and sisters, and he means it. It means, he understands that there was a bunch of Chinese soldiers that sort of poured into Tibet and gave the Tibetans a dreadful time for many decades, still do actually. That he would understand are individuals who are just driven by their particular circumstances. So again, the Dalai Lama's evenness and gravitas really comes from insight. So it comes from what we're studying here, also the Vipassana that comes from, again, the Abhidharma that we're doing. Yeah. Yes?
Can you say something about Tuguryan's practice of clarifying perceptions?
Okay, the question is, the previous question, sorry, I should repeat. It was a question about the Dalai Lama's, you can say, evenness in in facing various circumstances. So that was what I was talking about. And then there's a question about if I could talk about Tugurjen's way of purifying perception. Tugurjen here is referring to a particular methodology in Dzogchen, which I would, for all present purposes, argue is what we're actually studying with the Abhidharma. And it is really and it's basic to all of Vipassana and pretty much all of Buddhist meditation, is that we're not retreating into a particular point of comfort, but we're actually looking at our reality. And it's through looking that we'll be set free. You know, the truth shall set you free and all of that. So that's what we mean with purifying perceptions. Simply just looking at what is it that we're assuming exists in a solid way. So just like any scientist would take and put something under observation and really get to know something through observing, then this practice of Nangjang, or refining perception, really is about looking at the objects of our perception and the perceiver as well. So we'll essentially the coming chapters will highlight that. Yeah. Yes.
Would you have any pointers on how someone can make the teachings their own?
Yeah, that's a great question. Do I have any pointers on how would someone make the teaching their own? Essentially owning the teaching? Wow, that is, it's early in the year, but that might be question of the year. It's a bit like when they gave Barack Obama the Nobel Peace Prize, right? No, but that is really all we're doing with the Buddhist teaching, is making it our own. Because everything that the Buddha taught, everything the Dalai Lama would want, is for us to make the teaching our own. You know, there's a place where the Buddha gets this question. He says that some people are saying, well, we've met several gurus, but they're all claiming that to teach the truth. And who should we believe? Now you're teaching us, what should we believe? And the Buddha says, you should never accept my teaching out of respect for my person, but only on the basis of your own inquiry. So it's all about owning and making your own, you could say, observation, and deciding for yourself what is true. What the Buddha has offered is something that you can verify, you know? I mean, you can see, obviously, something's working for him, you know? Something's working for the Dalai Lama, you know? Something's working for those who practice the path. So we might want to give them the benefit of the doubt, but we're going to have to do it on our own. So everything that we're doing in the Buddhist teaching, we approach a little bit like a scientist and say, okay, I'm gonna verify whether this is valid or not. So we should, right from the start, have actually the greatest expression of faith in the Buddhist teaching is actually to doubt. Because when you doubt, then you question, but you'd only question if you actually, or rather your doubt will unveil whether something stands up to scrutiny, whether something is really true. So if something actually, if you could assume that something possibly is true, you can actually really, you know, if you know somebody's ridiculous, you can't even bother to question them because you know it's just too ridiculous. But if you know that somebody's can be trusted and they're saying something you don't get, then you can actually really sort of get after them saying, what exactly do you mean? You know? If your accountant says something, you know, then you say, what exactly do you mean? You know? And you know that he probably got the math right, but you want to have it clarified, yeah? Yeah. And that's also why you have the whole modality of, you don't just have the theory, but you also have the whole modality of meditation and the whole practice of, you could say, ethical conduct as a way of integrating this understanding in everyday life. Yeah? So one thing is you have the science, you could say the hard intelligence, but you also then have to apply it. And that's where, again, you do this through the practice of meditation. And again, meditation is going to be entirely our own. You know? We're completely on our own. I mean, we can sit and fake it, we can look incredibly serene, but we might just be sitting there.
Because it's going to have the flavor of the person, isn't it? Like,
yeah.
Each person's will have an individual expression of what that applied truth looks like.
Yes. But then they will probably agree. For example, let's say when we talk about Vipassana, it is about letting go of rigidity, yeah? And so there will be a sort of common theme there's a common theme that runs down through all the different Buddhist traditions. They will all say more or less the same. They'll say it in their particular vernacular, depending where they're from, but they'll all agree. That's a really important point, but you might have really strange ways of presenting it. I remember one of my teachers, Chikanima Rinpoche, was talking about this teacher back in Eastern Tibet. People would come and say, so, how should we practice the path? And he would just say, well, this is it. He was a Dzogchen practitioner, and, for him, just being present, being connected with reality, that was it. And he says, well, this is it, And he actually, he had, that was his particular path. So that's where it can sometimes be a little bit difficult. You run into, the Zen koans, right? Which are about short-circuiting our logical mind. But it might be so confounding that we don't know what to make of it, Okay, here's a long question. Okay. Jakob, just repeating what I've heard many times in the teachings. Water, if you don't stir it, becomes clear. Mind unaltered finds its true peace. Yep. When we don't alter the mind in meditation and we find clarity there's still the sediments lying on the bottom. Those sediments seem to arise later because the fact that we've settled the mind. So it seems like the real deal is to eliminate the sediments, regardless of whether the mind is settled or not. What does the Abhidharma say about that? Oh, good. That's good. Yeah. That's where we could say that's the limitation of what we call shamatha, or just mindfulness practice, is that the mind just becomes peaceful. And having a peaceful mind would make you an excellent sniper. Having a calm mind would make you a really great mafioso. It would make you a great cheat, a great, all sorts of, you're just effective when you have a peaceful mind. But you're right, what the Abhidharma is about is getting down to the sediments, that which confuses the mind. But the thing is, for us to get to those sediments, we're not going to get to them if they're all over the place. If you have a glass of water with all the sort of particles inside and it's agitated, you can't get hold of all the particles. It's only when they settle down that you can really see them for what they are. And that's why you need to have the shamatha, or the calm abiding, in order to get to actually clearly seeing these sediments of ordinary confusion. Yeah? So that's what the Abhidharma says. Okay. All right. We'll conclude the theoretical component at this point. I'll just chant a few verses of dedication. Yeah. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be free. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish evermore. Okay, we'll take a 2-minute break, and then I'll say a little bit about meditation, and then after that we'll practice the meditation. I'm going to say a little bit about meditation. So everything that we're doing here and we're talking about here really, actually just on the last question there from Peter, in terms of, and also from Saul actually, in terms of just making this our personal experience and actually how do we actually go about this, it needs to come about through us experiencing. And that's actually where meditation does something that we normally never do. It actually takes us out of our heads. It takes us out of our ordinary distraction. It takes us out of our ordinary sort of, it's not that certainly within meditation, we're not going to close the world out. We're not talking about sensory deprivation, and we're not talking about sort of going into a particular cosmic sort of fetus position where we sort of can find ourselves again. But rather with meditation, we're beginning to allow ourselves to feel and connect with reality. And it was sort of in contemporary, you know, especially here in the Shire, right? We sort of talk about being connected, you know, and there's truth in that. It is about us connecting with reality, and that's where we don't need to fear reality or escape from reality. But what we do with meditation is actually provide a moment of stillness where we could actually begin to be sensitive to reality. And that's where very often we're just not sensitive or aware. And that's where the value of sitting cannot be overestimated. There's absolutely nothing nothing indulgent about meditating. The last thing we actually want to do is meditate. You might think that meditation is something about just sitting and being passive, but it's not. It's actually pulling out the plug for our entertainment. It's pulling up the plug for all the dope that we normally are sort of filling our horizons and our perceptions with. And it's actually feeling to actually be alive, to actually connect with being an individual experiencer and making peace with that. So, you know, you might think, good grief, this is, I remember as a kid, I used to read the Peanuts, and I remember there was Lucy who had this great thing. She says, Charlie Brown, I've been watching you and I've made a slideshow of all your neurosis. And then there's this whole thing, there's the whole sort of thing that goes on about Lucy showing Charlie Brown sort of slideshows of his neurosis, you know, and he sort of runs out of there going, ah. But the point of meditation is not that all of a sudden we're going to confront our mind, we're going to sort of all of a sudden face horrors and things will arise and so on. That's not really the point. It's more that we just make peace with the fact that we exist, and we actually exist naturally in a very dignified way. We needn't actually be alienated or at odds with or troubled by our psychology, our experience. But that also is not just like, oh yeah, I'm just going to meditate and everything's going to be fine. I'm just going to bliss out and it's going to be just perfect. I'm just going to sit here and chant Om and everything's just going to be beautiful. You know, that's going to work until the novelty wears out. That's going to work for a little bit. And you might look around at the other people who are meditating and saying, damn, they all look so peaceful and I'm not, you know. And all our usual psychological material is always going to be happening, whether it's benign or dramatic or trauma or memories or obsessions or whatever it might be. There's never going to be a time where meditation is going to take us into a different realm. But what we are doing is beginning to identify that these thoughts and this, you could say, agitation that takes place within our mind, yes, it takes place within our mind, and we could actually, you could say, take our seat within that. We needn't actually be horrified by that. We needn't actually react to that. And that's where meditation is very radical, because it's not just about dealing with the narratives and, you could say, analyzing and sort of essentially going over things again and again. That can have value because that would enable us to have some sense that it's not something, you could say, a big, impossible situation. So that's why analysis can be very helpful, because we begin to understand how the various conditions have shaped our experience and so on. But at the end of the day, everything that we experience in terms of our memories and so on, is being experienced right now. And the way that we're experiencing whatever we're thinking of right now is totally conditioned with what's going on with us right now. So there'll be one day we can look back at something that happened 2 weeks ago, and it can be like really insulting. So and so said this to me. And then we can go back at the same memory at a later stage, and we think about, yeah, so and so said that to me, and so what, probably that person had a hard day, And so it's so much to do with how we, in the very present moment, are relating to our psychological material. And that's not just being positive thinking, that's actually being real. So we have to understand every moment that we are alive, whatever is happening this very moment. And we're actually given choices about whether to be absorbed in it and perpetuate it or not. And that's where, when we study Abhidharma and we begin to understand the constructed nature of all our perceptions, then we can actually feel justified in actually just allowing these things to be. Just like someone was saying, you could have a glass of water with sand in it, and you agitate it, and the whole glass will seem very sort of murky. And you place it on a table, and it'll actually, the sand will sink to the bottom, the sediment will sink to the bottom, and you'll have clear water. So there's nothing strange about what we're doing with the practice of meditation, except we're just providing a place where we could actually be clear. But like I said, we are so often driven by our agitation that we don't want to stop. We actually don't want to meditate. Sometimes it's interesting. People who are new to meditation, they're like, wow, this is far out. I really want to meditate. You see the old Buddhists, they're like, I have to do something. I have to answer emails. I have to, I have to go places. It's very important. And there's this sort of whole no, I'm not going to sit there again. Nothing happens. But that is actually the place where that's actually the place where we begin to inhabit who we are. This is actually where we begin to settle in to the place where we're actually comfortable with who we are. Otherwise, we're just continually addicted to entertainment, to being distracted, to being doped, to being caught up in stuff. So as much as people could whinge that meditation is boring, it's actually just the place where the ego, the ordinary habitual, you could say, addiction to agitation is not being met. The addiction to just some drama has to happen, yes, that's not being met. There's a little bit of a sort of withdrawal taking place. And so that's where it actually is a place where we begin to find our own, you can say, autonomy. And that's where meditation really has its value. And it's from this perspective then that we begin to have some sense that, yes, thoughts arise, but we needn't necessarily tag along with them. We needn't necessarily be absorbed by them. But as much as we can talk about this in terms of theory, it actually has to be something that we do. We can all talk about the value of not being addicted to, it could be opioids, it could be screens, it could be anything. So that's where the actual value lies in actually us, you could say, getting off the substance. So in that sense, meditation is really doing ourselves a tremendous favor. The general gist of meditation is there's two aspects to it, which is what we call Shamatha and Vipassana. And that is, the first Shamatha is what was known as calm abiding. It's a sort of conspicuous aspect where we sit and we really provide the ideal conditions for our body and our mind. We provide a structure in terms of just sitting. We sit on chairs if it's needed, or we sit comfortably. But the point is really that we begin to inhabit our body, and we are grounding ourselves in our body. And that actually provides for some physical calm. And it's within that physical calm then that we could then begin on to focus on psychological calm, which is then the practice of mindfulness. And that's where we practice mindfulness in terms of just coming back to focus. And of course, it's very nice that, you know, you have these classic mantras like just be here now and so on, but you try and be here now. You know, it's a great thing. We should be here now, but it's not that easy. And that's why the Buddha very compassionately designed the practice of mindfulness in the sense of being mindful of, for example, breath. Sometimes we're mindful of an object, sometimes we're mindful of the breath. Here I usually would say, be mindful of the breath. And that means that we have something to come back to. We're always going to have thoughts. We're always going to be dragged away, or at least we're always going to receive invitations to tag along with some thoughts, some little interesting thought or memory or rumination or whatever it might be. We're always going to, and usually the thoughts, they get traction. We're off right away. And that's where to have something that we come back to is quite helpful. Of course, you might say, well, I should just let the mind be in its natural state. But very often, just being in the natural state, we're actually just sitting wondering, what is that natural state? So that's where just coming back to something that's completely non-conceptual is actually very helpful. Coming back to the breath is actually coming back to something that is entirely free from any reference point. Or, yes, there's a reference point, but it's not conceptual. So that's where mindfulness of breath is very helpful. And that's the first point that I generally propose here is the posture. The second point is then the coming back to the breath as an antidote to us drifting. It's just like if I always give this example, if we're sitting in a cafe and we're having a conversation with somebody, we are naturally focused on the person we're having a coffee with. And there might be a lot going on around us, but it would be very annoying for the person that we're with if every time somebody walks by the table, we're like, you know, it's going to be very difficult to sustain any kind of relationship there. So the same way as we do that, then also when we are practicing mindfulness, we're mindful of the breath, and it doesn't mean that we're asking everybody in the cafe to sit down and be quiet because we're having a conversation. We don't do that. We just focus on the person we're talking to. Similarly, also, we're not going to stop thoughts, but we're not going to tag along with every thought that arises. And that's the very specific, it's almost the nitty-gritty of mindfulness practice, is that we actually focus on the breath, not too rigidly, but still, it's the place that we come back to, and we're aware of the thoughts that arise, but we come back to the breath. And that's where we would talk about touch and go, in the sense of we're aware of the thoughts that arise in the mind, and it actually provides a little bit of a spark. Something's happening. The fact that we're thinking is a good thing. It's not a problem. We shouldn't condemn our thinking or demonize our thinking. It actually provides for a little bit of a spark, but it's important that we're then not carried away by it. And that's where we're just aware of the thoughts and we just are not distracted. And that's where coming back to the breath can be quite helpful. So it's not as if we just need to sort of absorb ourselves in the breath and we're sort of ignoring all thoughts, and thoughts are an annoyance. It's more that, yes, thoughts arise, emotions arise, physical, psychological sort of circumstances arise, but we just come back to this presence through anchoring our attention with the breath. Again, not too tightly, but still, just having that, you could say, attention. And so that's the second point. The third point then is, with regards to the thoughts, that whatever arises, for the duration that we're meditating, we actually we take the luxury of simply just labeling it thinking. We might have to think about our accounts. We might have to think about an important conversation we're going to have. We might have to think about a number of things. And yes, that's fine. But for the time that we're meditating, we actually switch off. Normally, as we switch off with TV or distraction or something or other. But here we're actually gaining some autonomy in switching off, not in the sense of being distracted, but just in the sense of that we actually exist beautifully, independent of our narratives, independent of our distraction, independent of whatever it is that occupies our attention. We could actually just be present without necessarily tagging along with everything that arises. And that's where the practice of calm abiding, shamatha, it also goes into a dimension of vipassana, because this is the place where where we normally get absorbed in our thoughts, and there's a little bit sort of like a tunnel vision that happens with regards to me and my thoughts and my situation and me. And actually, through letting go of that, there's actually an opening up to and connecting with a wider space. That also means an awareness of the other, an awareness of where we are. And that's where then the practice of mindfulness leads into this dimension of autonomy, this dimension of wider perspective, that we're not, you could say, being absorbed by our thoughts, but we actually sustain this wider awareness. So that's the general gist of meditation practice. And that is pretty much how this sort of thing runs really as a red thread through all aspects of Buddhism, from basically as soon as we start Buddhist meditation and right up to practices like, in the Tibetan tradition, we talk about Mahamudra and we talk about Majjhimaka, we talk about Mahasandhi or Dzogchen, and all of these various practices of Vipassana. But right from the word go, really, in the Buddhist teaching, we're actually training ourselves in not getting sort of caught in the ordinary fixating mind and sustaining this, you could say, openness. And something that I like to do here, and which I was taught within my tradition in Tibetan Buddhism, and which is pretty much universal among all Buddhist traditions, is that you precede meditation with some degree of something that sets an atmosphere. So for example, the Theravadan tradition, you'd very often read sutras, and even in some of the Theravadan retreats, you would actually still read. In Pali, but even though you don't understand all the word, it creates a certain atmosphere. And in the general Buddhist teaching, we have something called Buddha Anusmiti, which is called recollecting the Buddha. And it's really just the practice of thinking of the Buddha as something that inspires us. If the Buddha doesn't particularly inspire you, then think of something that does, possibly Gandhi or Mother Teresa or what have you, just something that basically opens up to a wider sense of something that lies beyond the ordinary confusion of ego, of the ordinary limited mind. So in that sense, this, you could say, preceding any kind of practice with form necessarily enables then the practice where we just simply let the mind be, enables this to actually gain a much more, you could say, much more weight in terms of entering into it. So here there's a short liturgy that you've all been handed, and we will just chant that. It's not very long, and then on the basis of having chanted that, then we'll just do some sitting practice. So we'll first just chant this, and then we'll sit for 15 minutes. That's just today, though. I'm thinking of going back to I think next week what we'll do is 2 sessions of 15 minutes. So what we'll do is a little bit different from how I've done it in the past, but we'll do this liturgy here, and then we'll do 15 minutes of sitting, 5 minutes of just walking meditation, and then again 15 minutes of sitting. And walking meditation is also quite valuable because that's actually where we integrate bodily movement with mindfulness practice. Just a note about the language in these liturgies. It's very devotional. And that's because as much as Buddhism is non-theistic, there is a component of the sacred as something that's innate to us. And that sacred dimension is something that's not touched by ordinariness. And so when we invoke the Buddha, we're not invoking the Buddha ultimately as some great cosmic parental figure, but it has very much a flavor of bhakti. It has very much this flavor of veneration. Just like in our culture, we have plenty of love songs. Then also in the cultures of bhakti, you have plenty of love songs to Krishna or Radha, or also in the case of the Buddha, to the Buddha. And this really is invoking something that is sacred, something that is greater within ourselves. So at the end of the practice, we actually dissolve the reference point of the Buddha as external and then just settle into meditation. So ultimately, it's not about, the bhakti language is not ultimately about constructing some external savior, but it is very much about establishing the conditions for honoring something within ourselves. And the Buddha is really just the catalyst. The Buddha as external is really just the catalyst for that happening. All right.
How would you like the cushions move for the walking?
Well, we won't do walking meditation today because we haven't really thought it through, but we'll
Today's just the
we'll have some working meetings. How about that? We'll have some committees that will discuss how we'll do this.
So you just do the 15.
Yeah, we'll just do 15 minutes today. Next time we'll do a bit more. Okay, so I'm just going to bring this up on the screen. So in the text, I think, yeah, there's a little bit of a quote there, and it sort of highlights really the value of thinking of the Buddha. I mean, if you think of, depending really who we think of, right, it really conditions us. You know, you can sit and ponder, you know, various people that might not put you in a particular good mood, you know. Very often when we sit with our friends and we sit and whinge about the politicians and whoever else, you know, it kind of puts you in a really bad mood, right? Or sort of despairing mood. So likewise, also thinking about the Buddha is actually something that sort of, you could say, empowers and lifts us, leaves us in a much more creative space. So anyway, we'll start first. The first 4 lines we'll chant 3 times, and the rest we'll just basically read through it. Okay. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. May all sentient beings enjoy happiness and the causes of happiness. May they be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be separated from the sacred happiness devoid of suffering. And may they dwell in boundless equanimity that is free from attachment and aversion. As the union of unborn emptiness and the ceaseless appearances of interdependence, magically there appears before me in the sky, amidst vast clouds of offerings, on a jewel lion throne and lotus sun and moon disk seats, the incomparable teacher, lion of the Shakyas, his body the color of gold, adorned with major and minor marks, clad in the 3 Dharma robes, he sits in Vajra posture, his right hand gracefully poised in the earth-touching mudra, and his left hand in the gesture of meditation, holding an alms bowl full of nectar. Like a mountain of gold, magnificent he shines in splendor, spreading beams of wisdom light across the whole expanse of space. The 8 close sons, 16 elders, and the like, a vast ocean-like retinue of noble beings encircles him all around. Simply think of him, and he grants the glory of the highest bliss, liberation from samsara and nirvana, the 2 extremes. He is the great being, perfect embodiment of every source of refuge. With your great compassion, you embraced this turbulent and degenerate world and made 500 mighty aspirations. You are as exalted as the white lotus. Whoever hears your name shall never return to samsara. Most compassionate teacher, to you I pay homage. All my own and others' virtues, the body, speech, and mind, together with all our possessions, visualized like Samantabhadra's offering clouds, I offer to you. All the harmful actions and transgressions I have committed throughout beginningless time, each and every one I now confess with intense and heartfelt regret. In all virtuous actions of the noble ones, ordinary beings, accumulated throughout the past, present, and future, I rejoice. Turn the wheel of the profound and vast Dharma teachings, ceaselessly and in every direction, I pray. Your wisdom body is like space and remains changeless throughout past, present, and future. Yet in the perception of those to be guided, you go through the display of birth and death. Even so, let your form body continue always to appear. Through all the virtues I have accumulated in the past, am accumulating now, and will accumulate in the future, for the sake of benefiting all beings who are as infinite as space, may you, the sovereign of Dharma, be forever pleased, and may all attain the state of the victorious one, the Lord of Dharma. Living beings like us drift in this degenerate age, have no guidance nor protection. Because of your kindness, caring for us with surpassing compassion, every manifestation in this world now of the three jewels is your enlightened activity. You are then our only refuge, incomparable, supreme. So from our hearts we pray, with total confidence and faith. Do not neglect the great promises you made in times gone by, but hold us until we attain enlightenment with your compassion. Supreme Teacher, Bhagavan Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher, Bhagavan Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher, Bhagavan Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Te yatao muni muni maha munaya soha. 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 Om 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 Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. From the Buddha's body there emanates a great radiance, a multicolored rays of wisdom light, dispelling all our own and others' obscurations, and causing all the genuine qualities of the Mahayana path to rise within us, so that we attain the level of perfection from which we never into samsara. To return to the text a bit further down, where it says, the miraculous display of the unsurpassable wisdom appears as the intentions, deeds, prayers, knowledge, love, ability of all the Sugatas and their children. May all beings become exactly like them. And then a bit further down, there's something called the aspiration prayer of Maitreya, which kind of brings home the scope and you could say, the aspiration of the Bodhisattva path. It's quite extensive, and I guess one day we could sort of go through some of the things that inevitably pop up in terms of what does it all mean. But for the time being, we'll just recite it. I prostrate to all the Buddhas and to the Bodhisattvas, endowed with the divine eye of the sages, and to the Shravakas as well. I prostrate to Bodhicitta, which counteracts birth in all lower realms, perfectly shows the path to the higher realms, and leads to no aging nor death. Whatever negative actions I have done under the influence of an afflicted mind, in the presence of the Buddhas, I fully acknowledge them all. By the accumulation of any merit I have created through the three kinds of activities, may my seed of omniscience grow, and may I attain awakening that never ends. Whatever offerings to the Buddhas that can be found in realms of the 10 directions are known to the Buddhas who rejoice in them. I rejoice in all these offerings. I fully acknowledge all negative actions and rejoice in all merit. I prostrate to all the Buddhas. May I attain supreme primordial wisdom. I earnestly request the Bodhisattvas who reside on the 10 levels in all the direction of the world in the 10 directions to awaken into supreme enlightenment. Once you have awakened into genuine enlightenment and tamed the Maras and their hordes, may you turn the wheel of Dharma so that all living beings may be healed. With the sound of the great Dharma drum, may you free all sentient beings who are suffering. Throughout inconceivable millions of kalpas, may you remain and teach the Dharma. Mired in the swamp of desire, entangled in the strands of cyclic existence, I am fettered by all that binds. I supplicate those, supreme among humans, to look upon me. The Buddhas do not blame sentient beings who are flawed. With loving heart for all sentient beings, may the Buddhas free them from the ocean of cyclic existence. Any perfect Buddhas who are present, those who have passed away and those yet to come, may I train following in their way and engage in enlightened conduct. Having perfected the 6 paramitas, may I liberate the 6 families of sentient beings. Having actualized the 6 extraordinary faculties, may I reach unexcelled enlightenment. Future phenomena are not born, and those past will not occur. Present phenomena have no inherent nature. There is no actual location. There is no perception. There are no outer things. May I realize the Dhammadhatu of emptiness. According to the Buddhas, the great sages, there are no truly existent sentient beings nor life forms. There is no truly existent individual and no nurturing of a self. May I realize the Dhammatta, where the self is not present. An entity such as grasping on to a self in mind is not present within any of the paramitas. To benefit all sentient beings, may I give with generosity, free of avarice. Since things do not exist, may my wealth appear spontaneously. Since all things totally disintegrate, may I perfect the paramita of generosity. Endowed with a flawless ethics that is guided by rules, and an ethics that is completely pure, with an ethics free of an arrogant mind, may I perfect the paramita of ethics. Just as the elements of earth, water, fire, and wind, bodhisattvas do not get caught by mental constructs. By attaining patience, anger never arises. May I perfect the paramita of patience. Through the power of previous perseverance, having become stable, enthusiastic, and free of laziness, and through a strong body and mind, may I perfect the paramita of perseverance. Through the samadhi where all is illusion-like, through the samadhi of the hero's stride, and through the samadhi that is like Abhidharma, may I perfect the paramita of meditative concentration. Through actualizing the 3 gates of full liberation, the equal nature of the three times, and the three types of knowing as well. May I perfect the paramita of prajna. Through persevering in a bodhisattva's practice, may I attain the kaya, praised by all the Buddhas, the luminous kaya, and the kaya blazing with majesty. Thus may my intention be fulfilled. May I be like the famed Maitreya, who engaged in such a practice, perfected the paramitas, and perfectly abides at the zenith of the 10th level. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of Samsara, may all beings be free. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. May the Buddha appear in this world. May the light of the teaching shine like the sun. May the holders of the teachings live in harmony, and thus may all be auspicious for the teaching to endure. We pray for the good health of the teachers. We pray for their precious lives to be long. We pray for their activities to spread and increase. May we be blessed never to part from the teachings. Akashasya stitiyavat yavacha jagataha stitihi tavan mama stiti bhuyaha jagadukani nignataha. Akashasya stitiyavat yavacha jagataha stiti tavan mama stiti bhuyaha jagadukani nignataha. Tavan mama stiti bhuyaha jagadukani nignataha. Tavan mama stiti bhuyaha jagadukani nignataha. As long as space remains, as long as the world remains, may I too remain to alleviate the sufferings of the world. Thank you. Thank you. Just going to make a few announcements. I always forget to do this, but now that I'm remembering it, and also because this is the beginning of, you could say, the semester and the year and all of that. A few things that's going on here, so you might want to know. First of all, tomorrow night at 7 p.m. I'm doing an orientation pretty much about all of the programs that I'm doing this year, which includes seminar workshops and regular weekly practices, studies, retreats, both sort of in real face-to-face and also online. So tomorrow at 7 p.m., if you're on the mailing list, you should have the link to the Zoom. And if not, shoot me a mail, jakob@si.org.au, and I'll send you the info. And then also, so there's three online courses. This Monday thing is being sent online, as you can see. There's also a program on Wednesday morning, just so you know, which is more about Vajrayana Buddhism. It's called Journey Without Goal, but it's a really interesting study by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And I'll be continuing that for a couple of months, I think. And then I'll be going through a text by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which is a commentary on Shantideva's Way of the Bodhisattva. It's called A Flash of Lightning in the Dark of the Night. And then on Sundays, I do a text which is sort of a classical text on what we call the gradual path to Lamrim, by someone called Longchen Rabjam. And it's a text that's called Finding Rest in the Nature of Mind, that runs from 5:30 to 6:30 on Sundays. Other than that, then there's, just because I was doing the homework for this, I'm going to start a course on Thursday, and it's going to run for 6 Thursdays from 7:30 to 8:30 at night, and it's called Training in Tenderness. And it's essentially, you could say, a teaching on what we call bodhicitta, or this sort of the awake heart, the soft awake heart of the bodhisattvas. But I was just really marveling about the teacher. It's a Tibetan teacher who's lived for many years in the States, Ziga Kongtrul Rinpoche. And he just explains this really important topic in such clear and compelling language. And so I'd warmly recommend that. And again, you can just go on our website and it should all be there, si.org.au. All right. That was the advertisements, the commercials. Other than that, I'd like to say you're actually, this place now transforms into a soup kitchen. Michela has actually made a big helping of soup, and I think there might be enough downstairs. If not, she's also got bread and stuff. So you're welcome to pile on down and have some soup. You've been sitting here for several hours, so just sort of get a little bit of a refill. You're cordially invited. So, okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jakob,
What?
your Sunday program, have you started already?
Yeah. The Sunday program has started yesterday. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do we have cushions or like that?
Actually, just leave the cushions. Yeah.